So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today, inshallah, we're going to be talking about demystifying the concept of purification. And, it's a very long topic, really. But what I'm going to try to do as much as I can, I'm going to try to break it down and to try to make it as much as I can something that is really easy and something that we can understand. So can you see the new screen that I shared? It's a green screen. Can you sorry, a white screen. Can you see what says what breaks wudu and all that? Um can you see it? Can somebody answer? All right. So just tell me if you could see the screen.
Yes.
Okay, good. Sorry, I can't always see what's going on. All right, so here we go. I thought it would be a good idea to actually start with identifying the issue of purification. What does purification mean, and what does really tahara mean? So tahara generally means, just means to be clean. But when we're talking about cleanness or cleansing, we're actually talking about cleansing yourself from certain impurities. And certain impurities, najasa has two forms. So when we're looking at najasa, which is the opposite of purification, we're looking at two forms of najasa. The first one is a minor impurity, which generally called a ritual impurity. So a ritual impurity, we're talking about the person in front of you doesn't look at all like they had just been into a state of uncleanliness or impurity. All right. So that type of impurity, you basically need to do wudu in order to cleanse yourself and to be able to perform certain rituals. So this is more of a ritual impurity, which is called al-hadath al-asghar. The other type of najasa or impurity is called the major impurity, which basically needs a shower, a complete shower, in order for you to perform certain tasks. Now, I'm going to go really fast. I'm not going to talk about the different types of waters, but what makes najasa, what makes an impurity? So, what does an impurity, if you're saying somebody is pure or impure, they're pure from what? And they're impure from what? So, what are we talking about? So, the different types of najasas or impurities that make a person in a state of impurity are things like human urine and stool, gushing blood from animals that you the animals that we don't eat, or gushing blood generally is considered najasa, and differences of opinions when we're talking about human beings, but let's just try to make it as simple as we can right now. So the amount of small blood found while cooking, for example, beef, meat, and different foods, that's not najas. That's a small amount which you will see in the pot, for example, even though you had washed your meat, but that's not considered as najasa. The That's, it's considered mafuwan an, which means it is permissible. It's something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala dismissed. We don't have to, put it in water for a few days in order for us to make sure that there's no quote unquote impurity, if we're going to call it impurity. The other najasa is flesh and blood of animals that we do not eat. The animals that we don't eat are considered najas, and the animals whose flesh is halal to eat, their urine and stool is tahir. So if you step in it, for example, by mistake, you do not have to redo your wudu. For cats, though, we don't eat their flesh. Their saliva and sweat are pure. So I'm just going to go really quick. Carnivore animals, their urine and blood is najas. Carnivore animals, carnivore animals, of course, whether wild or whether we're talking about birds like hawks and eagles, they're still considered as najas. The human semen, there are differences of opinions on between scholars on that one. So I'm just going to, when something has differences of opinions between scholars, I'll just use that just to let you know. If you hear different opinions and if you hear another scholar say otherwise, don't be too stressed about it, because they also have different supporting evidences to those opinions. The other thing that causes an impurity that's we're talking about is female infant's urine, not the male, but the female infant's urine, and it has to be washed, versus the male infant's urine, who's only breastfed, so only if he's nursed. In other words, organic nursed and breastfed milk, that is the only time where it would be considered as as that urine as not najis, but ينضح عليه الماء, meaning that you would just kind of like splashing water on it to probably reduce the amount of urine within it. Human blood is najis as well, with differences of opinions between scholars on what that and how and what that means. Now, the other part is that when we're talking about impurities, there are certain actions that may cause an impurity. So we did mention some of the things before, but what also can cause an impurity in terms of action? Things like a wet dream or an orgasm for both men and women. So we're talking about a pulse in the private area, or at least an ejaculation that would be considered as an impurity in itself, whether the person was in a dream or whether the person actually participated in an action that is, of course, beginning or the end or a complete penetration. That would be considered a major impurity that actually requires a complete shower. And the same thing when we're talking about things like masturbation as well, that also requires that is considered a major impurity and would actually require a complete shower that the person has to do. Now, it is important to mention that things like a wet dream does not prevent the person from fasting. So even if a person had a wet dream, they don't have to stop their fast. And yet, for things like an actual induction, let's call it that way, of lust, such as and going into the intercourse, whether that was the beginning or whether that was inducing, whether it's intercourse or whether it's masturbation, that would actually be considered still an action that requires a complete shower and is considered a major impurity. Things like menstruation, I'm going to go in lots of detail about that, so bear with me, inshallah, and postpartum as well, and we're going to be talking about that. Now, I just so that I won't forget, postpartum, an OB checkup and a pregnant woman's water breaking are not impurities. They don't break your wudu. With differences of opinions between scholars on that, of course, we're talking about the amniotic fluid and the water breaking, whether it's impure or pure. So I just wanted to note that. By the way, some of the things that I will be saying may have differences of opinions between scholars, but I'm trying to make it as easy as I can without going into all the differences of opinions. Now, the other part, which is the minor impurity. So what's the difference between a minor impurity and a major impurity? For a major impurity, you have to take a shower once it is completed, or at least like a menstruation once it's completed, or a postpartum once it's completed. But for other things, you still have to take a shower. So in order for you to be able to perform rituals, you would have to take a shower, but not all rituals. So for Ramadan, for example, you don't have to take a shower before starting your fast. Same thing with, let's say, janaba. What is janaba? What janaba is basically when a person is in a state of impurity due to, let's just consider it as the discharge due to complete lust or orgasm, whether that was intercourse, wet dream, or whether that was masturbation. So I'm not here saying masturbation is halal. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about the effect and the implication it has on tahara. So bear with me. I'm talking about only the implications of tahara. I'm not talking about whether it's halal, haram, just like I'm not talking about whether intercourse with a wife or outside a wife. I'm not talking about that here. We're just talking about the effect it has on tahara. All right. The minor impurities are different because minor impurities are simply the different things that can happen, but you only need to do the wudu. Okay, you only need to do wudu for it, and it's considered a minor impurity, in where there are different rituals that you can do even if you don't have that impurity, but other rituals they may require, even for that minor impurity, that may require that you would have to make wudu for it. So all you need to do is just the wudu. The other minor impurity, so when we're looking at it, we're talking about things like passing wind, gas, of course, using the bathroom. When we're talking about using the bathroom, it's not going inside and washing your hands, but we're talking about urinating or of course doing the excrementing, any bodily discharge from private area. And I want to focus on that one just a little bit, because when we're talking about any bodily discharge from private area, there could be many private discharges. All right, when we're talking, especially with women, there's the cervical mucus, and there could be sometimes an illness. So we're looking at that now. Not any bodily discharge. This is too much of a general word, but I just wanted to let you know that most scholars will call it just kharij min as-sabilain. Even women actually have more than exits in their bodies, of course, in their private area. But just to let you know that the general rule is, if something is discharging from your private area, the general rule is that it is an impurity. This is the general rule. So just the general rule. Now, for bleeding, we're looking at what type of bleeding that is going to determine whether this is a minor impurity or a major impurity. I'm going to talk about that later on. The vomiting, differences of opinions when it comes to vomiting, and when we're talking about a minor impurity, we'll talk about that later on, inshallah. So what difference does it make? So somebody that is not pure, in other words, in a state of impurity, the issue of touching the Quran, there are different concerns about that. The general ruling, for example, is that women during their menses, during their menstruation, they can't touch the Quran. Okay. Now, this is the most common opinion. This is the majority of the scholars' opinion, but there are some scholars that had differences of opinions on. We're going to talk about that later on whether if she's reading it orally without holding the Quran, or whether she is holding the Quran. So just wanted to point that one out, because there are differences of opinions. We're going to get to that hopefully, inshallah, if we have time. The other part is that when we're talking about purification, it's going to affect the prayer. The prayer, whether it's a fard or a nafil, whether it's an obligatory prayer or whether it's a voluntary prayer, then we're talking about differences, no differences relating to one, whether it's a major impurity or whether it's a minor impurity. So in both cases, major impurity and minor impurity do actually affect salah, and therefore you have to remove the major impurity and the minor impurity to perform salah. Same thing with tawaf, which is going around the Kaaba, and during Hajj, it does actually require tahara. See your local imam or your local guide for fatwa on if you need to do tawaf al-ifada or tawaf al-rukun, and etc., and what you have to do. Okay, because don't take it from here and say, oh well, I went back home and I didn't do that tawaf al-rukun right there. So in that situation, there's more to come. Not in my class, but in other classes. Now, when it comes to women and menstruation, there are so many different details, and just a real, just a number of things we'll talk about right here. So when it comes to women and menstruation, the Prophet ﷺ actually says, "Al-mu'minu la yanjus," a believer does not get impure. And he also said to Sayyidah Aysha, when he told her, "Nawilini al-khumra," not al-khamra, but al-khumra, which means the prayer mat. He told her, "Give me the prayer mat," and she said, "Well, I've got my period." And the Prophet ﷺ told her, your menstruation is not in your hands. In other words, the rest of your body is pure. So the impurity is really, يسألونك عن المحيط قل هو أذى. The only impurity is really in that bleeding itself, and not necessarily in the rest of your body, and definitely not in your mouth, not in your hands. So therefore you can perform different actions. Why did she say that? Well, clearly there was this notion amongst the Jewish women in Medina that if a woman has her cycle, then she cannot touch anything, and she's supposed to be impure. And that was the influence of the people of the book, where she thought that was the same in Islam as well. So when you're on your period, you're not necessarily impure. It is the bleeding that is impure. Now, the biblical sense of impurity is not part of Islam, and this is really important to mention. The biblical sense of impurity, the biblical sense of how do they justify, and what is the justification between women in general having a period, is not necessarily part of Islam. So just be careful with that. In Islam, it's not whatsoever a punishment for women because of seducing Adam and causing him to exit from Jannah. That is actually not in Islam. In fact, they both left Jannah. Um, and the same thing, a woman is not cursed, but rather just in a state of major impurity because of the period. That's it. It's a simply biological thing. In other words, a physical thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created in women, which is why the Prophet ﷺ actually said that it's just a matter that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala كتبه على بنات Adam. He just created it. In other words, he made it part of our own creation on the women and the children of Adam. Now, here's the part when it comes to touching Quran, since we're here, the issue about touching Quran. So are women supposed to be touching the Quran or not? There are differences of opinions between scholars. And the reason for the differences of opinions between scholars, now this is really important. When we say differences of opinions between scholars, that doesn't mean that, you're going to be imagining them like having a fight and one is depending on strong evidences and the other one is not depending on strong evidences. Sometimes the reason for that is really the interpretation. They can be depending on the exact same authentic evidences. In fact, they could both be depending on the same exact evidence. Let's give an example. The ayah says لا يمسه إلا المطهرون. The same exact ayah was used by both of the scholars that said that women are allowed to touch the Quran, and the scholars that said that women are not allowed to touch the Quran when they're in a state of their cycle or postpartum. They used the exact same ayah as a reference. All right. Now, how did they explain it? So the first group that said that women can touch the Quran, they said, again, this is can touch the Quran. They said, لا يمسه إلا المطهر. Are pure, so none shall touch it. So I'm going to write it right here. So the word is yamassuhu. Sorry, I don't have a touchscreen on that one. Yamassuhu. So this little pronoun right here, is it necessarily, in other words, if I would want to in English, it's basically it. Okay. So none shall touch it. Is the it, that pronoun is it referring to the Quran in that context, in that ayah in Surah Al-Waqi'ah, or is it referring to Al-Lawh al-Mahfuz? So that actually, we could see it even though it's just the same ayah, but that actually also brought in differences of opinions between scholars. So some scholars said, well, no, you can't use this as an evidence to prove that women can't touch the Quran because that ayah is referring to Al-Lawh al-Mahfuz. The other scholars said that no, the nearest noun that was before this ayah, in other words, the pronoun it, is referring to the nearest mentioned noun, which is Al-Lawh al-Mahfuz. So there it is. So now, how do we explain this? Well, let's go to the hadith to help us understand it. So in the hadith, for example, the Prophet ﷺ, in many hadith, the Prophet ﷺ, for example, in this hadith, the Prophet ﷺ told her, your menstruation is not in your hand. So they said, here it is. The other evidence that they used is that when Sayyidah Aysha was going to Hajj, the Prophet ﷺ comes home and he sees her crying and said, you probably got your cycle. And she said, yes. So the Prophet ﷺ said, this is just a matter that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created in the women of Adam. افعلي ما يفعله الحاج غير ألا تطوفي بالبيت. Do what a person performing pilgrimage does, except one thing. Don't go and do that going around, the Kaaba. So from that, they said, well, what does a person doing their pilgrimage do? Number one, they said, well, they read Quran, they do tasbih, they do dhikr, they do sa'i, all those different rituals. And based on that, they said, well, this includes reading Quran. So, I'm just saying in general, just because we have so many different issues that we need to talk about. So just in general, the same evidences, even those scholars that actually said, well, we've got another example another hadith where the Prophet ﷺ actually forbid the women that are on their cycle to touch the Quran or enter the masjid. The other group of opposing scholars, they said that hadith was not authentic. The other scholars said it was. The other scholars said it was. And how can they have differences of opinions on authenticating a hadith or not? What is the baseline? So that's a whole different study. That's a whole different study in hadith, but just wanted to let you know. Now, the other evidence that they used, they said, well, we also have qiyas. What is the qiyas? Well, they said, well, qiyas was when you take one matter and based on that matter, you find the common illa in it, the common reason in it. So what is the common thing? Well, they said, well, janaba, when a person is in a state of, after intercourse, in a state of janaba, that is, they don't touch the Quran, and they're not allowed to touch the Quran, even though Ibn Hazm had actually considered that that's not authentic, or at least not the preponderant ruling. They also based it on that, and they said, well, no, just as women in a state of major impurity, she doesn't pray, so a major impurity is just like another major impurity, which is janaba in this case, and said, well, based on that, then having that same illah, which is major impurity, the same illah to mean the same common reason to something, therefore they both actually cause a major impurity, and therefore they cannot touch the Quran due to that. Now, I'm just...
Dr. Aysha Wazwaz, are you still there? We cannot hear you.
Yep, I'm here. Sorry about that. All right, so let me continue. I'm going to try to skim through it really quick. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. I have to... All right, so the other part... So to make the story short, relating to reading Quran, to make the story short, is that there are differences of opinions between scholars on reading the Quran. Now, in that situation, what should we do when there are differences of opinions between scholars? Number one is that if you're able to see and trust a scholar, who you trust their knowledge, you trust their iman, you trust their research, and you trust their taqwa, then take their opinion and see what they regard as preponderant, and you can actually, as a muqallida, or as a muqallid, what is a muqallid? A muqallid is somebody that is not a scholar or a talib al-ilm in fiqh. In other words, they're not able to study fiqh, they're not able to review the evidences, so they're simple in their knowledge about Islam. So what they do is that they would basically consider a scholar and trust a scholar to give them the preponderant ruling. What does it mean to have a preponderant ruling? It means that by weighing the evidences, you're looking at the evidences and you're letting the evidences actually prove an opinion to being more accurate or not. Now, when we look at one opinion being more accurate than another opinion, this is actually telling us that what is determining something is really the opinion and not how many scholars say what. It's not an issue of how many say what. It's an issue of what is the evidence and how do we understand the evidences. All right. Now, the other part, when we're talking about, sorry about that, when we're talking about, there's another, hold on. All right. So what breaks wudu? I also wanted to mention a number of different things because this is really common. Number one, we mentioned the issue of using the bathroom. The other part, which is sleeping, coma, and loss of mind, do not alone in themselves. That is, do not break the wudu, but because the person sleeping or in a coma, because the person might have lost their wudu when they didn't realize it, that's why it would be considered as a wudu breaker. The other thing, which is semen discharge with pleasure, requires a shower to remove impurity. We mentioned that one, which is whether it's intercourse or whether it's masturbation. The other thing is medhi. This one is really important to talk about because this happens a lot with sisters, especially newly wed sisters. It's a clear discharge from pleasure, but not intercourse. So there's some type of a pleasure, but it's not intercourse. It's sticky, elastic, and more common in women. There's a pleasure, certain pleasure. A certain pleasure or desire that basically arouses, and that arousal affects the body, of course, chemistry, and therefore a discharge takes place. That only requires wudu and istinja. So now the istinja is really washing the private part, but not a shower because it is minor impurity. Now, the other part, which is the cervical discharge. The cervical discharge, very common questions on that one. The cervical discharge, which basically now il-wadi, not il-wadi, this is actually wrong. It's actually called il-wadi, is it's very similar to the cervical discharge in many ways. Il-wadi is not the cervical discharge. So this is one of the students that actually made these notes right here. But il-wadi is more the discharge that the body body discharges while urination or while using the bathroom, that is. The cervical discharge, that's the white vaginal discharge, and it usually comes out, for example, it doesn't have to be during bathroom, or it can be during excessive workout, or it can be just during the day. And of course, with a cervical mucus, the cervical mucus is always there. That's what actually makes the vaginal area wet, and in order to continue just doing different things. But in the end, is that does it break the wudu or doesn't it break the wudu? Differences of opinions between scholars on that. So why would they have differences of opinions, even though the women during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, of course, like women today, are constantly getting it? Well, here's the thing. There's not a single hadith or a single ayah actually talking about the cervical mucus. All right? This is really important to mention. And even though during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the women, the Prophet ﷺ had 9 wives, for sure, they had this kind of discharge. And this kind of discharge, it's constant in women, especially in their early teens and 20s, that this is constant, that they're getting it all the time, and it's always there, and it's really hard to keep the garments clean from those different things. Now, scholars have, I'm just going to make it short, scholars had differences of opinions on, 1, whether it breaks the wudu or not, 2, on whether it also impurifies the garment. See it? Whether it purifies, and that's a big issue, for a woman to tell her, hey, you also got to change your garment. And let's say she's shopping, or she's at work, and she's getting this constantly. And not all women can handle those different mini pads or whatever it is, to necessarily wear it. So in that situation, it's really important to keep in mind differences of opinions between scholars makes it easy for the sister when in a situation where she can't take, let me call it the preponderant opinion, or she can't take the majority of the scholar's opinion. So in that situation, does she necessarily have to renew the wudu? It's best if she does. it's best if she uses a new garment or at least a cleaner garment. But if she didn't, there is an opinion that regarded it as not an impurity, not on the garment, and not even an impurity on her body that is needing requiring wudu. The other part is menstrual bleeding. We're going to talk about that in just a bit, inshallah. So vomiting and bleeding and other than menstruation, even if severe, has different opinions on whether it breaks the wudu or even breaks the fast or not. This is really important to mention that one. So for Shafi'i, they're considered the amount of vomit and affecting the fast. Touching your private part. Touching your private parts has different opinions between scholars based on um, I look at the student. She actually put based on Sister Aysha believes it does not break your wudu. This is actually the notes. These are actually the notes that one of my constant najasa, they're, for example, urine disorder, they're on dialysis, they're constantly passing out gas, and constantly, for example, bleeding or whatever it is, well, definitely they should seek a doctor. But so if a person is constantly having bleeding or constantly having a urine disorder and they're constantly, what does constant mean? So every salah, they have it that have that they have that problem every single second, and it's not something that they can control. All right, in that situation, they can ignore, they can make the wudu for every salah and then ignore whatever is causing that constant najasa all the time. So even if a person is doing dialysis, for example, they don't have to worry about, well, let me redo my wudu again because anyways, this urine is going to be coming out and it's not something that they can control. So in that situation, they don't have to worry about the najasa per se, but they can actually just make wudu for every salah, and the najasa, the impure ibadat or we're talking about orgasm, ejaculation, intercourse, menstruation, postpartum. The dead, they have to be completely washed unless they are a shaheed in the battle. How to perform ghusl. So if she needed to do ghusl, that is the complete shower. Fast before we go into this, if she just stands under the shower, just lets the water flow on her, this is enough. If she wants to do it, let me say, with more deep purity, just to stay away from differences of opinions because the Hanafi regarded that not necessarily. Say Bismillah, wash the hands 3 times, wash private parts, make wudu, okay, wash the head, hair, and in other words, let the water run through your body. What would have all these different braids, beautiful braids. In that situation, you don't have to unbraid your hair, except for the period. And this is actually differences of opinions between scholars. So even that part, let's say the sisters, I'm not sure what they call them, but the braids, what are they called? Have, and do they, even if they finish their period, do they necessarily have to unbraid, which can actually be $200 and probably more to do all those different braids. Differences of opinions between scholars on whether you have to unbraid them after a period, but there was more of an agreement that you don't have to unbraid your hair because of showering from janaba is basically after complete arousal, which we talked about, intercourse and etc. And the washing the whole body. So washing the whole body. This is an extra part in where the rubbing the right side, then the left side. If you just let the water flow over your body, or so I'm just gonna go to the other slides, or maybe I can. hold on. Maybe we could just do it from here. Um, hold on. Let me. You know what? Let's do it from here. So when we're looking at different types of bleeding, so women have different types of bleeding. There's the menstrual bleeding, there's the other bleeding, and there's the postpartum. So the whole idea about the fiqh of menstruation, it's all really about differentiating between these three different types of bleedings. It and hopefully, all right. So the other slide, here we go. So for the menstruation and cycle, what you could see right here, I'm just going to, if you can see the slides, I wanted to put it more in a colorful thing where you could actually see it. So what we're doing is telling the difference between a menstrual and a postpartum bleeding. All right. So for the menstrual bleeding, it's basically the bleeding that a woman's body discharges, of course. Texture. This is really important. So focus on that one. The different texture for the menstrual bleeding and the istihada, those are the ones that tend to be, I would say, probably the hardest thing. So bear with me and please focus. Now, the menstrual bleeding is reddish blackish color. It has a It's thick. And what we mean by thick, all right? I know this is going to be really gross, but I find it the easiest way to explain it to sisters. You know how the syrup that you put on your pancakes. I'm extremely sorry for using this example, but it's really thick like syrup. All right. So even when it goes into the toilet, it is thick like that. All right. Now, this is the best way to identify it because sisters usually think if they see red, this is a cycle. Not necessarily like that. The cycle is reddish blackish color. It has a stinky smell, a fish like smell, and it's thick. It goes into the toilet in a very thick way, in where it is very similar to where it has clots and those different things, and usually is accompanied by different symptoms where we're talking about cramping, probably different pains, probably back pain, leg pain, cramping, abdominal pains, all those different pains that sisters would know. Now, when we're talking about that, it's really simple and easy to identify if we're talking about a normal situation. If we're talking about a sister that has a cycle every 21 to 28 days, well, she knows exactly. There we go. She's simple and easily identifying everything. Now, for the brown discharge, all right, is that brown discharge necessarily part of a cycle or not? But here's one thing: the brown discharge is actually considered old blood. In other words, it's the bleeding that was still inside of you that didn't come out. In other words, it came during your period days. Now, scholars had differences of opinions on whether if that brown discharge came before the cycle. In other words, your period starts out with a brown discharge, and then you get the cycle, and this is always the way your cycle goes. Or let's say the brown discharge comes at the very end of the cycle. All right. So scholars had differences of opinions on whether that brown discharge, on whether if it is part of the cycle in the beginning, if it comes in the beginning, or whether it is considered part of the cycle if it's at the end of the cycle. So I just wanted to say differences of opinions just to let you guys, we have to have at least the foundation of how we understand the whole picture of it in order to make it easy. Okay, differences of opinions makes it really easy in where if we go to a second level and say, well, this is the preponderant, we first have to lay out to understand differences of opinions and lay out that field, that spacious field in where what are they really saying? Why am I asking this scholar? He's telling me one thing and that scholar is telling me one thing. There are differences of opinions between scholars on the longest and shortest days of a cycle. So you'll have one scholar, for example, Hanafi scholars, for example, will say, well, the shortest, longest days are 10 days. The Shafi'i will tell you the longest days are really 15 days. So who do I depend on? All right, that's a different story, but just to lay it out right there and understand the general and the preponderant ruling is really there's no evidence, not on the longest days or the shortest days. That is really dependent on more of looking at the different textures of the cycle. So if a sister has her cycle, it would be haram for her to fast, to pray, or even have intercourse, and she makes up the fast. That's an easy one. So the postpartum. It's really easy to identify postpartum from menstrual. Guess what? If you're able to identify postpartum from menstrual, you have crossed probably, I would say, 80% of the whole bleeding identification. Postpartum, after 12 weeks of pregnancy, if whether it's an abortion or whether it's a miscarriage, if the baby is aborted or had a miscarriage and it's 12 weeks old, that would be considered postpartum. If it's younger than 12 weeks, that would not be considered postpartum, and it would be considered istihada. It would be considered istihada. So what does that mean? Istihada. Let me just use that term to clarify it really quick. Istihada just means any other bleeding. So think of it as a nosebleed. Think of it as a cut in your arm or your finger, whatever it is. Okay, so you're going to treat it as such. All right. So if it's 12 weeks and under, you're going to consider it as istihada / just like a nosebleed. As long as non-white discharge is present till 40 or 60 days. So the Maliki considered that the longest time for a postpartum to bleed for is 60 days. For Shafi'i considered 40 days. Differences of opinions between scholars. I'm not here necessarily saying the preponderant ruling. Just keep it in mind. Now, for postpartum, a sister, if we say, well, this sister is in a state of postpartum, she doesn't fast, doesn't pray, and of course, there's no intercourse, and makes up fasting only. Makes up fasting only. We're going to talk a little bit more about fidya and kafara later on. Now, for the istihada, it's different because for the istihada, of course, it's very different. It's basically vaginal bleeding. Vaginal bleeding that is not a period and is not a cycle. All right, so it's a vaginal bleeding. It's not a cycle, and it's not a postpartum. She didn't have a baby. There was no baby relating to it whatsoever. All right, so in that situation, it is considered like an illness. Now, what do they consider it as in medical terms and all that? That's not the issue. Was there a cyst? Was there some kind of a rupture? Whatever it is, that's not my issue here. Our issue in fiqh is different than the medical issue. So the reason to it could be so many different reasons medically. So you'll talk to your OB relating to that. Now, what does an istihada look like? Well, here let's compare these two. I think they're called rhombuses, right? Are they? Or parallelogram. All right. So any color other than white, okay, is considered taking the rule of istihada. So what we talked about the brown right here, okay? There's no smell versus this one has a very stinky smell. It's not thick. And I want you to keep in mind when we're looking at istihada, many times sisters will say, why she changed 5 pads or 3 pads or whatever it is, or probably a pad every 15 minutes. Well, make sure you see your OB, but fiqh-wise, this has nothing to do with the amount. It's not the amount that we're looking at. It's not about the amount. The amount could be probably even more than a cycle. She has an illness. She probably had a cyst. She had something rupture. Something happened. All right. This is not relating to the amount. This is relating to the type. The easiest way, especially for sisters that get things like IUD or contraceptives, and especially the IUDs tend to be the most confusing, especially the one, not the Paragard, but the other one, I think it's called Marina. That one is probably the most confusing confusing IUD that sisters often call me for, whether they're confused because of the different bleeding and because the IUD has hormones in it that confuses the sister's cycle, and then everything just goes all of the. The easiest way to identify istihada from menstrual is really to look at smell. Smell tends to be the easiest way to recognize. Why? Because I've noticed that sisters, when it comes to color, all of a sudden she forgets the difference between red and blue. Uh, no, this is real. You would say, is it blackish red? And she's like, you know what? What does that look like? She would forget. And I don't blame them. I don't blame them because it is, when it's red and when it's a lot, it's really hard to identify. Did it really turn black or what color is it? The best way, two ways are the easiest ways to identify. And guess what? Even with cramping, if the sister had an IUD, she could also be cramping. And that becomes really hard. Or if the sister had probably, like I said, some kind of an OB problem, some kind of a medical problem, she could be cramping as well, and then it's hard to identify. Two easy ways: smell. That's the first thing you're going to look for, and two, the thickness. The thickness is really important to look for. What does the thickness mean? Remember that yucky example that I gave, which is the syrup? That's exactly like it. So for that yucky example that I put in, a cycle, you could see it dripping and dripping in the toilet in a very thick way. This is actually a cycle. Versus when you look at the istihada, no, you see it as if it's an ink that pretty much diminished. It got the whole toilet full of all these different colors, but it didn't come down as if it's a thick substance. So that would help you identify these two things. Again, it's that thickness, number one, and two, the smell. Those are the two easiest ways to identify it, because sisters, they get lost. Like I said, I'm always getting, probably the most calls I would get is really how to tell the difference between this one and this one. Now, in cases where sisters, they would have irregular bleeding, this is so common, they would have irregular bleeding. For the sisters that have irregular bleeding, in that situation, they would actually look at the reddish, blackish, or with a smell and all those. So especially with the sisters that come irregular bleeding, and this is really common, by the way, a lot more common than you think. All right. So for the sisters that have irregular cycle, I'm going to tell them, well, let's find those days. And then we're going to go based on genetics and say, well, your aunts, what is the average between your aunts, your sisters, your mom? What is the average days of their cycle? 6 to 7 days. Okay. Did you ever have a history of having a regular cycle? So if she says, yes, when I was 15, 16, I always had regular cycles. So in that situation, we're going to say, okay, your regular cycle is based on the regular cycles that historically, or in your life's history, even though, medically speaking, the cycle fluctuates in timing and how it actually happens throughout a woman's life, and the different things that may affect it. But in general, so we're going to say, okay, well, let's look at those days, and you're going to be looking for 6 to 7 days, hypothetically speaking, if that's how many days she used to menstruate when her cycle was regular, or when her mom or sisters, the average of their cycle. So we're going to say, let's use that as the average, and if she's constantly bleeding, that is, and we're going to use that as the average, and we're going to ask you to look for those times within this, were those times that you're finding the smell, the thickness, the clotting, the blackish red, the cramping, and all those different fun stuff. Well, yeah, they're not fun. Okay. All right, you're going to look for these things, and that's when you're going to relate to, okay, found those days, you're going to stick to those days and regard it that here is your cycle, and you're going to consider that, okay, every 21 to 28 days, I'm going to be looking for these textures. All right. This is for somebody with an irregular cycle. So with istihada, if a sister has istihada, what does she do? Well, she does fast, she does pray, and she is obligated to fast and pray. What does that mean? So for prayer, she makes wudu for every salah, right? Makes wudu for every salah, and She doesn't have to worry about the discharge, doesn't have to worry about the bleeding, even if it's coming down. Don't worry about it. Your prayer is obligatory, and make wudu for every salah as long as that discharge is coming down. So and then move forward. Even if you're still feeling something discharging, don't worry about it. Focus on your salah, and that's it. For fasting, she's obligated to fast unless she's probably going anemic by now. So unless she's going anemic or stuff like that, then the reason for breaking the fast is because of an illness and not necessarily related to istihada. So in other words, it's relating to probably anemia, probably because she's losing a lot of blood or whatever it is. So in that situation, that's relating to she would be breaking her fast if she needed to. Again, if she needed to, she started feeling dizzy, she's getting dehydrated, whatever it is, the cause. That's not relating to istihada necessarily, but it's relating to the symptoms that she's facing. Scholars had different opinions on sexual relations, so just keep that in mind. The other thing, I hope I'm sorry, there's so much to cover. I'm just let me just at least cover some certain issues. I'm going to try to go as fast as I can in order to focus on what's important for sisters, within this short amount of time. So when we're looking at the important things for Ramadan, the things that relate to sisters, and I'm just gonna who must fast. That's one issue. Maybe I could make this one bigger. That way I could see it. And it was let me go faster. And okay, so here's one thing I would like to focus on, that one. A very common in general, if they are in a healthy situation. But if the person is not in a healthy situation, and in other words, they are terminally incapable, they're going to be forever incapable of fasting. So in that situation, they would pay the fidya. They would pay the fidya, and a fidya is pretty much feeding, like, it's feeding one needy person, not one ill person, sorry, one needy person per day. And that would be approximately $10 or to $11. So you want to see, local masjid, or in your local currency, and what that amount is. And that would be for a whole month of $300 or $350, depending on the currency and depending on the situation. So they calculated it and made it easy for you. So that would be called the fidya. All right. Now there is also differences of opinions between scholars. I know I'm passing my time. Differences of opinions between scholars on women that are nursing or women that are pregnant, on whether they should also pay fidya if they needed to break their fast because of pregnancy or fear of some kind of a hardship, or in a negative effect to harm their babies. Whether it's because of nursing or whether it's because of being pregnant. Now, generally, fasting is obligatory, but if the person had a reason to break their fast because of going on a journey, or had their cycle, or postpartum, or there was a temporary illness. Sorry for the typo here. Temporary illness, probably got a flu, COVID, God forbid, all those different things, cancer, whatever it is. Okay, they had a temporary illness. Inshallah, this cancer, hopefully, inshallah, it'll be temporary. All right, so in that situation, they would pay kafara. But pay kafara, for menstruation, you can't pay kafara. For menstruation, you would have to make it up by fasting. For postpartum, you would have to make it up by fasting. For journey, the kafara is fasting. For temporary illness, the kafara is fasting. So the kafara, the expiation in this situation, the kafara is by making up on other days because of the ayah. So I'm trying to go as fast as I can in order to cover. I think I've been my lecture was for an hour, so I hope I don't take over the other speakers. I'm trying to go over the most important things. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer. I hope I covered the issues that the sisters were wanting me to talk about.
inshallah, Dr.
وإياكم.
Aisha. Inshallah, we're gonna have questions. If sisters have any questions, they could type them in the chat box, and then we could go from there, inshallah.
Somebody's telling me we can't hear you. Oh, that was when I went upstairs to silence my children. I can't focus when there's movement around me, so I'm like, okay, that's it.
Right.
I cannot focus, and my children know that. But I guess for that minute, they were like, okay, let's just have fun.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so I don't see any. Oh, is an infant's vomit an impurity? Whether okay, I think you're talking about the reflux. Okay, the reflux is not an impurity. All right, the reflux, and I know what you mean by that because my children had lots of reflux, and it was if you want to know if a sister is if a sister's baby's always having these refluxes, and which is burp, right? The burp, that would not be considered as a vomit. All right, that wouldn't take the ruling of vomit because that is a reflux. That's exactly like when you get an acid, and it's the acid that's coming out of your stomach, and that's why when they burp, they don't necessarily get the same kind of acid. When before we vomit, we would feel the saliva coming out first, which is protecting our mouth from the abdominal acid. So that's the difference between that not cervical, but sorry, that burp, or what else did I call it? The burp, or the reflux that they're actually getting. So it's not considered as impurity, and I know what you mean by asking that question. So no, it's not impurity. It's just an acid reflux. Um, Here's another question: When the discharge is like istihada, but occurs when the discharge is like istihada, but occurs at the time when the sister is supposed to have her period, looking at her calendar, does she have to break her fast or not? So every bleeding, there's a general default. The general default in a woman's bleeding that is a vaginal bleeding, the general default is that it's a period, unless proven otherwise. What does that mean? So it has to be a period unless there was something that proved otherwise, an illness. You don't see any smell. It's outside of the calendar, and or you're getting something different. Okay, if it's within the calendar, that the general rule, the general default is that it should be your period, unless proven otherwise. So don't always, not every single time you see a discharge, you're going to be like, oh, I wonder if it's istihada. No, the general rule is that it is a period unless proven otherwise. This is the general rule. All right. All right. Here's another question. What is the ruling regarding wudu for older adults who are incontinent and need to wear a brief diaper? Can they pray even with the brief on? Absolutely. Absolutely, and especially for somebody that is ill, and wearing, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah, this is such a hard thing even on the person. I know that you might think of yourself as cleaning the other person. It's really hard even on the person that's needing to face this. So yes, if the person is incontinent, they needed to change diaper all the time, etc. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us all as-sihha wal afiyah. Yes, they can pray even if they are in that state. If they had an assistant helping them purify themselves for every salah, and it wasn't causing that much of that hassle, and they're able to move around and able to do it, or they've got an assistant to help them do that, then yes, they can actually make wudu for every salah, even if they're wearing those diapers. Here's another one. Also, is it possible to get a copy of this PowerPoint? You know what? I can send you the whole. I think I have a PowerPoint, and I also have a PDF. So yes, it is. I will be. In fact, I did actually give this whole seminar into on. It's on YouTube. It's available on YouTube. It's almost like 5 hours. 5 hours. This whole lecture is actually 5 hours. I just took just excerpts from it. But yeah, I can send it. I can send it, inshallah. Any other questions? All right, wa iyyakum. So I think this here's another question. There's a hadith of Sayyidah Aisha that the sister should wait until her discharge is white before praying. Does that mean that if at the end of the period the color is very light and we don't consider it istihada, but we consider it like our period? Not quite. So she doesn't have to wait for the cervical mucus as long as you got three things to identify the end of your cycle. Number one, the bleeding stops. And you can wait for a whole day to make sure that the bleeding really stopped rather than taking a shower 5 and 6 times that day and still spotting. Okay, you can wait a whole day. All right. And scholars had differences of opinions on whether you have to make up those salawat. Preponderant is yes, make up those salawat when you weren't really sure in it, but you were just waiting to see if you're going to get spotting again. Okay, so in that situation, you may not get the cervical mucus right away. The cervical mucus may not be discharged until probably 4 or 5 days after your cycle finishes. It's all based on that ovulation and stuff. So the cervical mucus does not have you don't have to wait for the cervical mucus to make sure that your cycle ended. The end of a period can be identified by even what is called jufuf. In other words, it's dry. You're wiping the area with a white napkin, and it's showing that it's dry. There's nothing there. In other words, there's nothing, no discharge. And what we mean by no discharge, there's no mark of a cycle. So whether we're talking about bleeding, or whether we're talking about brown discharge as the discharge that is coming during the cycle time. All right, that would actually mean that you're still on your cycle and you have to wait. Um, all right. So, any other questions? All right. So I think this marks the end of my lecture. Jazakumullah khairan. And this lecture will be put up on YouTube. I will send it to the sister that made this event possible. And Jazakumullah khairan. And I'll also send the PowerPoint as well. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Jazakallah khair, Sister Dr. Aysha Wazwaz. We had a wonderful time. Alhamdulillah, I think most of us learned a lot of new things. Alhamdulillah. Inshallah, we'll take a break for now and we'll come back for Sister Sabir's interview at 5:45. So this is a Asr break. In the meantime, we'll just post up Sheikh Dr. Waswa's Facebook link onto the chat, and also her 5-hour lecture that she has about feminine hygiene, inshallah. And we'll see you both. We will see you all around 5:45 in around half an hour, inshallah. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum